The first poem I'll share is from my book, Water and Salt, and it's a poem written after Chinese poet Bei Dao's poem, Toxin. Drowning. Autumn's breath catches short. A mother's window open to light, marbling in leaves, music of a world in vivid decay, a lifeboat shedding its cargo. It's yesterday's currents, its love. Sorrow dark and bottomless as the ocean. When a ship collides into the present, I take a moment to bury my hopes for tomorrow. Give me another history. I've made a shroud of belonging, a refugee tent pitched in the mud of memory. And then the second poem I'll read from the book is, I think of it as a poem of an Arab childhood. Copybooks. Our teachers were kind in the way that people who have sipped tea or shopped at the local bakery with your parents would be. They taught us to stand upright and motionless when people who had control over our lives walked into the room. They taught us to chant at the daily morning assembly praises for the king and the country and the right heroes and the important revolutions. They taught us so well we believed the chants, drank them into our bloodstreams, and loved the stick figure histories of the songs. They taught us to copy in perfect curlicues and lofty upstrokes across the page beautiful equations they solved for us, and facts about combustion and the life cycle of honeybees. Most of their teachings served us well. We live in the shadow of leaders' palaces. There are always long lines, so good posture and deference are our currency. But best of all, they taught us poetry. They tucked gleaming verses into our hearts and let them sleep for years. They said, remember these words. This is where you're from. Write this in your copybooks. I have a deep love for teachers and teaching. It's a relationship that surfaces in a lot of my poems, maybe because my grandfather and my mother were teachers and they are some of my favorite people, but there are a lot of teachers who surface in the poems. And this one that I'll read next is from a forthcoming manuscript. It was published in poets.org, and it's entitled Gloria. And the title I apologize in advance, will plant the Laura Branigan song in your head for the rest of the day. So sorry about that. Gloria. In the late 80s, in the middle of middle school, we break from studying our ancestors, pass on the Phoenicians for a while, leave the terraced fields of Canaan and the hanging gardens of Babylon for European history. Miss Magda is our guide, and she contextualizes the continent, intertwines it with our own lives, the shapes of our maps, the narrowing of our family names. She has no patience for girls who are charmed by France, even though a veil of Chanel No. 5 unfurls over our heads as she enters the room, nor for adults who praise London's museums. She narrates a list of our possessions housed there. Miss Magda speaks many languages, the Queen's English, impeccable French, maybe others. Her Arabic is Cairene, her eyeliner distinctly Cleopatran. She speaks mushfara ma'ha, her mind. She names conquerors and the servile regimes they birthed. She expands the word ihtilal beyond its daily context, locates our current colonizers on a continuum of violence, sends us asking our grandparents for stories. She enacts her name as she towers over our desks and asks rhetorical questions. Katar khair al-Arab, who translated Aristotle, who filled libraries with books that would later make Renaissance b'ta'hum possible. In the middle of middle school, we are devoted to American pop songs a few years after they top the charts. Our childhoods are museums housing the no longer hits of the Reagan era. Miss Magda's year coincides with our Laura Branigan phase. She can barely tolerate our tastes. When she cannot escape playground duty and we are perfecting our hair flips, singing Gloria, she raises a perfect eyebrow in our direction, and I think maybe even smiles. In class, ever the historian, she remarks, ala fikra. That's originally an Italian song. وكانت مش بطالة بس خربوها الأمريكان. So, you have to have fun sometimes, even with the history of colonization, so you can live. The next poem I'll read is from my most recent chapbook, Letters from the Interior. And this is a book that also has some teachers in it, but it also has a relationship with Arabic grammar, and several of the Arabic past tense verbs appear as characters in the poems. Morning Lantern. Miss Sahar had spoken of this sister, أصبح, morning verb. And as she spoke, a sun had risen over her words. It was the most arduous lesson, one that required a tearing apart at the seams, a loosening of crimson thread cross-stitched in 7-branch cedars and rows of eglantine. To have become. More than the desolate stretches of perseverance, more than the eternally flowering fields of Cannes, to have become. Full fathoms of night traversed, and then a light upon the corrugated metal and slumped rooftops of the camp, gilding the limestone of what was, or bluing it from sight entirely. To have become. To pass from one form into another. Chrysalis dwellers finally cutting the wind with our own wings. Asbaha, sister of the earliest hours, from the edge of a sky, a call to the smallest prayer, and the sunbirds chorusing, their feathers flashing sapphire, emerald, and Fairuz on the radio, her longing and the day's headlines dissolved in our coffee cups. To have become, to sunder a sorrow from our bodies and rise to soft, unburned wicks, to live. Thank you. So I have one or two more, depending on how much time you want. One in Arabic, how do we feel about that? I'm feeling dangerous today.
لا حرام حرام. Okay. I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
Let's see if I'm looking for this on my phone, because this is a poem that was actually written for a wonderful project in Seattle by our former state poet laureate. She created something called the Seattle Poetic Grid. So it's a map of the city and invited poets to write about a place for whatever reason in the city and pinned the poem on the map. So if you visit Seattle Poetic Grid, you can find this poem. And it's inspired by a restaurant, a local Syrian restaurant here called Mamnoon. So I have to put my glasses on for this tiny print. ماء الزهر. كنا كما اعتدنا نترقب بداية الحرب الجديدة، فلكل موسم حرب وأحزان تواكبها، وفي ذلك الموسم أنزل الثلج سكينته على مدينتنا المتأرقة، فابتهجت جدتي التي سئمت مسرحيات الصراع وتأملت. كنا نصب على أول تلجة دبس وسكر، وسافرت عيناها إلى وطن بعيد كان للثلج فيه زهوة العيد ومذاق الحلوى. ما زلنا كما اعتدنا نترقب نهاية الهدنة الأخيرة، فلكل موسم هدنة وأهازيج تواكبها، وفي هذا الموسم ذرف شجر الكرز أوراقه على شوارع مدينتنا القلقة، وابتهجت أنا بذكرى جدتي التي فاح عطر مسائها من طبق حلوى في مطعم ممنون، ماء زهر يغني وطنه الأم ويستحضر الليمون في حديقة الطفولة، وغيمة من الثلج واللبن يكللها قطر السفرجل. فسمعتها تتذكر كان عنا شجرة سفرجل، وراحت تسرد حكايتها الدمشقية. نحن كما اعتدنا نترقب زيارات الأحبة، فلكل موسم ذكريات وعطر يواكبها. That's a poem for Teta Fariha, Allah yarhamha. And I'll just end with my most recent poem for Jerusalem, Palestine. This is published recently in the Rumpus. Fragments from a sudden crescendo. At the gate of mercy, they are firing tear gas. They have pushed us back, to re-envision landscape with an architecture of return. We gather, our stones have been told to wait, they have pushed us back with tear gas, stun grenades. Stadium seating, torpor of eyes trained on us, dispatches filed in guileless verbs. Of mercy, singed and defiant, we remain preparing our breakfast as they fire tear gas, stun grenades, live ammunition. Gates crenellated, sky widening, sultans stir in their sleep, offer archways to lift nightmares from their brows. Museumed graves intone a call to prayer for the living. We perform our ablutions in tear gas, our limbs stun, our hearts grenaded, our wounds live. Freedom, ammunition. Thank you.